George epitomized the real savagery of the sport. George epitomized the real savagery of the sport.
Foreman spread Frazier across the ring like he was apple butter.
He thought that the best way to deal with the world was just to become a monster.
The way he tells it is that the hand of God showed him exactly what eternal death looks like.
I had to learn the hard way. I'd be an evangelist on the street, and people would pass me by. I had to start selling what I believed in.
We've never seen a metamorphosis of any sports star in our lives like George Foreman. I mean, one is the grizzly bear, the other is the teddy bear.
The one thing you don't want to say around is cheeseburger.
Some people think of him as this guy who's very funny and very charming. Then there are the people who are stuck with the idea that he's this nefarious guy who's created this false image and he's really underneath a bully and an intimidator.
Look at George now. The big, round, shaven head, the smile, the eyes that seem warm and inviting. But we know that just below the surface is the George who once really scared us.
Foreman is going about his job!
From the opening bell, Foreman's only plan was to destroy his opponent. He threw every punch with mean intentions.
Cavallo being battered in his own corner.
Joe Frazier's punch is like a Pontiac car coming at you at 100 miles an hour, and George Foreman is like a Mack truck coming at you at 50 miles an hour.
He had hit me harder than any other fighter. Even though he didn't knock me down, but with one shot, I thought he knocked all my teeth out.
I got hit so hard by Foreman that the bone blew up inside my eye and burst from the inside out. And it was sticking out 1/4 inch out of my eye.
There was a few people that were auditioning for Rocky 1 was sparring with George Foreman. I said, what was it like? He goes, imagine someone taking a railroad tie and smashing it into your forehead consistently.
He had that determined look where he wanted to get on with it and get it over with and end the fights as quickly as possible. Don't waste any time. Just do it. If you look at the ring record book, it's all KO, 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 KO.
George Foreman was the one guy who beat more guys before they got in the ring. These guys were in there having instant diarrhea, looking at this guy going, oh, man, you know, what did I get myself into now?
When George Foreman fought Ken Norton, Foreman's just glaring at Norton, and Norton will not look him in the eye. You can practically see his heart beating in his chest.
George Foreman brought to the ring a sense of menace that had not been seen in the ring since Sonny Liston back in the early 1960s.
George was at one time a sparring partner for Sonny Liston and adopted a lot of Sonny's mannerisms, the glare, the abruptness and rudeness.
Liston was a guy who had done time for armed robbery, a guy who had been a real professional thug, and yet he'd been heavyweight champ of the world, and that's who George wanted to be.
They've seen this man already become heavyweight champion of the world, a successful boxer by being mean. So maybe he figured, well, I might as well be mean too. I'll get meaner.
At 37-0 with 34 knockouts, George Foreman met another fighter who had yet to lose. Although a 24-year-old mountain of muscle, he was a 3-1 underdog against champion Joe Frazier on January 22nd, 1973 in Kingston, Jamaica.
Anything to say, George?
It was the first time that he had been in a fight that was that important and that big and that monumental. When he got up into the ring, I remember him telling me, I hope he's not looking down at my knees, because he could feel them knocking together.
Most of the press corps thought Frazier was going to win because they just thought of Foreman as this huge, crude fighter. That Joe, at heart, was a terrific boxer, and he would just figure out a way to beat this kid.
But when they met in the ring, it soon became clear that Foreman's 4-inch height advantage and longer reach made it difficult for the 5'11" champion to launch an effective inside attack.
I think the collision of styles was in George Foreman's favor. That Frazier was going to come to him and that he was going to be able to hit Frazier.
You couldn't have built a better opponent than Joe Frazier for George Foreman. It literally was like teeing off on a golf ball.
Down goes Frazier! Down goes Frazier! Down goes Frazier!
Foreman spread Frazier across the ring like he was apple butter. And he went down 6 times.
I went back trying it again. Each time I went down, hey, man, what I'm doing out here?
Foreman is all over Joe Frazier. Frazier is down again. It is over in the 2nd round. George Foreman is the heavyweight champion of the world.
It took 4 minutes and 35 seconds for Foreman to become king of the boxing world. Then, in the afterglow of his coronation, it took even less time for the new champion to show how little he knew about wearing the crown.
After the fight, there was a huge press conference, and he said, "Nobody talks unless you get my permission. I'm the champion now."
I'd like to give you a beef for victory, and that's all for tonight. I'll see you everybody tomorrow.
George Foreman, who couldn't read or write into his teens, had no sense of what the outside world was all about, thought the media following him was out to mess with his mind.
I remember a press conference where somebody asked him a question, and George said, "I'll answer that outside if you have the courage to step outside."
He thought that the best way to deal with the world was just to become a monster. But beneath it was always that softness that he was trying to hide.
He could be the nicest kid in the world, and the next day you didn't want to be around him because he was sullen and he really didn't want to talk to you.
He gave off the persona of someone who was just hateful and mean and didn't care what you thought, didn't care anything about the rules, didn't care anything about life and your life.
George was searching for George. And it was harder to find mentally and psychologically than physically. He didn't know how to cope with the attention, the belt, with anything.
I had no doubts whatsoever that I was going to defeat Muhammad Ali. I was not afraid. I devastated Joe Frazier. I figured, hey, I'm just going to waste Muhammad Ali in 2 or 3 rounds.
In 1974, a year after George Foreman knocked out Joe Frazier, boxing's most controversial personality was stalking the heavyweight crown that had been taken from him 7 years earlier. Scheduled for September in Kinshasa, Zaire, the match was promoted as the Rumble in the Jungle.
Ali was not picked to win. He was actually picked to get killed in that fight. Foreman was a guy who destroyed Frazier, destroyed Kenny Norton.
And all vicious left sends Norton tumbling to the canvas.
But everybody thought Ali was going to get killed by Big George Foreman, the most powerful guy of his time, etc. Everybody was hoping he wouldn't die.
But if Foreman brimmed with confidence when he arrived in Zaire, he hadn't considered the magnetic power of his opponent. To the citizens of Kinshasa, Foreman was the heavyweight king in name only.
Here was this guy who had none of Ali's style, none of his wit, none of his charm, and he's heavyweight champ. It was Ali's crown that he was holding.
There were very few people at the airport to greet him, and when Ali got there, they had barricades up to keep people away from the airport and the airport area because he was so popular there.
Ali was doing the total Ali song and dance in Zaire. I mean, everybody, he was out running, he was greeting people. I'm back here with my brothers. And Foreman just was not in the mood.
Ali made himself a citizen of Zaire emotionally with the people, and he made George an interloper. He really convinced the people of Zaire that Foreman was white. He says, "Did you see the dog that George Foreman got off the plane with?"
He brings a pet with him, a German Shepherd. A German Shepherd was a symbol of the dog that had been used by the Belgian police to control them, and it frightened the bejabbers out of them. But George had no concept of this.
So George, without even knowing what he was spinning, was turning off the world and the public to him as a man.
When the fight was delayed a month due to a cut over Foreman's eye, Ali continued to spread his magic throughout Zaire.
It was that 30 days when he really lost his confidence and where he really realized, finally realized, that nobody was really rooting for him, that everybody was rooting for Ali.
By fight time, I doubt that there were more than a handful of people in Zaire who weren't rooting for Ali. You had this chant reverberating throughout the stadium.
Ali had learned this phrase in their dialect. Ali Boumaye, Ali kill him.
Muhammad got that Ali Boumaye chant going right from the get-go. He was the hero. The other guy was the enemy. George was the enemy.
The moment of truth arrived in the pre-dawn hours of October 30th, when the seething champion climbed through the ropes and grimly endured the thunderous arrival of his opponent.
Ali gets in the ring with Foreman, and ready to dance. And suddenly he takes a couple shots from Foreman, and he's saying, "This guy's a wrecking machine."
Well, he goes back on the ropes, the rope-a-dope. Come on, George, you ain't nothing. Show me something. George is throwing punches. Bang, bang, bang.
George Foreman got exhausted. He missed a lot of shots, and he was catching arms and everything else. And that's what emptied George Foreman's tank, missing them.
Part of what Muhammad Ali took advantage of in Zaire was that George was wound up tight with rage, that he didn't really have a second or third gear.
Ali fought the fight he fought, absolutely convinced that George Foreman would punch himself out. He said to me, if George Foreman doesn't get me in 7, his parachute won't open.
I hit him hard in the side. I mean, I got a good shot. And he said, "Is that all you got, George?" And I remember thinking, yep, that's about it.
Another sneaky right hand. Deciding where to go with the
That night, George Foreman learned for the first time in his life that that facade was a joke and that he really was a vulnerable man behind that glowering monster.
Ali just reached inside his heart and pulled away all the confidence that he had. He was the baddest of the bullies. He was the meanest of the fighters. He was all of these things. And then in Zaire, suddenly he saw something he had never seen before, and it really came crashing down on him.
The next day he goes to his dressing room. The entourage is gone, the people are gone. There's only George and the dog.
George could not deal with the public humiliation of having been outwitted by Ali. So he just kept sinking further and further into his emotional quicksand.
I came in one man and left out a shell of that man. And I really needed rehabilitation because of that fight. I was devastated.
He tried to have fun. He went on the party scene. He bought another house or two. He bought a few more cars.
I went over to his house here in Houston, a huge home, cars, Rolls Royces, everything out there. And I asked him how he could afford it all. He said, I need it all. I need it all. I love this stuff. I need it all.
He'd meet women. He'd bring them to the house. He was trying to find some way to get over that loss to Muhammad Ali, to show that I'm still a man.
George Foreman was a bully, totally self-absorbed, a hedonist in the ultimate sense, who cared for nobody and nothing at that point.
He said he wanted to beat women as much as he wanted to beat men. He had to pay one woman off $30,000 in an out-of-court settlement just to keep her quiet after he'd beaten her.
He tried putting himself back together over the next 3 years, but he could never quite capture exactly what it was that he needed to do to get back to the top of the heap.
Just 2 months after his loss to Ali, Foreman was rocked again. If the first bruised his manhood, the second shattered his sense of self.
George always had a bit of an identity crisis when he was growing up because he was twice the size of his 6 brothers and sisters, and it caused them to tease him.
All the other kids said, "You ain't one of us. You're a molehead." He didn't know what a molehead was. Well, it turned out that the molehead was a man named Leroy Moorhead.
George found out that actually his mother had had a liaison with a guy named Moorhead, and that's in fact who George's biological father was.
Once he met him, I don't think it was anything was there. It was just saying, okay, you know, I've seen my sperm donor, and that's it.
He vowed that if he did have sons, he would name them all directly after him so that they would never doubt who their father was. So all of them are named George Edward Foreman. The second, the third, on and on.
When someone goes through such extremes of persona as George Foreman has, that there's a kind of a desperate soul looking to find who he really is.
It was a very, very depressing down time for George. And then his friend, Marvin Gaye, the recording star, said, "George, what you ought to do is fight 5 guys the same night. Knock them all out. Show people that you're still George Foreman."
The suggestion appealed to Foreman, and on a single afternoon in Toronto, he won 5 3-round exhibitions, 3 by knockout. But the slugfest did little to improve his standing, much less heal his heart.
He thought he needed to reclaim his name, his title, his prominence again. But I could tell he was embarrassed by having to do that.
He had to be humiliated because he had to fight these 5 guys in one night, and it was a circus sideshow.
He had been invincible before Kinshasa Zaire. Now he was a laughing stock, and he brought it on himself.
Houston's infamous 5th Ward was the learning ground for George Edward Foreman. Born on January 10, 1949, he was raised by his mother, Nancy, a cook, and a father, J.D., who was hardly ever there.
My mom would come home sometime with a couple of these hamburgers. They were like 2 for $1, and she had 2. You got 11 people.
George's father was on and off as a provider. He was a railroad worker, but he had an occasional alcohol problem.
My mom had a nervous breakdown, and she had to go away to a hospital for a while. That left nobody but my sisters and George to raise each other. The anger came out of the fact that my father wasn't in the house with us, and George was lacking manly discipline.
He was a very angry young black man. And there were a lot of angry young black men that emerged out of the 5th Ward. Not exactly a loving environment for any human being, and George emerged out of it a very suspicious man.
He had a reputation all over the city. His reputation was not just in the 5th Ward. He was known as a mugger. He was known as a mean guy.
He would stand in the corner and he would drink wine, and he'd walk up to people and say, "Give me a cigarette." And if they wouldn't, he'd turn them upside down and take the cigarettes out of their pocket.
He'd simply tell you to give me your money. And a lot of times people just reach in their pocket and give it to him.
He used to like to tell jokes. Now, if you were in a group with him and running with him and he told a joke and you didn't laugh, guess what? The next joke was on you.
You could see the kind of the embryonic forms of the 2 Georges that we saw later. The teddy bear was lurking under there even while the grizzly bear was being formed at that age. He couldn't look at a stray dog without wanting to hug it and bring it home until he had almost a dozen of them running around in the backyard.
At 14, Foreman dropped out of E.O. Smith Junior High School. 2 years later, he entered the Job Corps, a work program for troubled youngsters.
The Job Corps had not changed him fundamentally. It had just given him direction in his life. And there was still a lot of simmering angers inside of him.
He'd rip the doors off of the hinges, and guys are jumping out of the windows and everywhere else because, man, George Foreman is on the prowl.
They called me and says, Doc said, we need you down here quick. I said, for what? We got a kid down there we can't handle.
Doc said, hey, if you're going to box, you might as well put on some gloves and come in the ring.
We got to working, I got to teaching him, you know, ready to box. He won his fights, so I sat him down and told him, I said, George, I said, you know, you can make the Olympic team and you can win the gold medal. He said, what's that? He didn't know anything about it. I explained it to him. He said, okay, I'll give it a try. I said, okay, let's go for it.
In 1968, Foreman won the heavyweight gold medal at the Mexico City Games. But what he accomplished with his hands had already been overshadowed a week earlier by the raised fists of American sprinters Tommy Smith and John Carlos. Foreman chose a more traditional way to celebrate his victory.
His trainer just handed him this little flag and said, take a lap around the ring. And so he waved the flag as he took his victory lap around the ring.
Well, this made him the good black guy. White Americans loved him for it. That's the way we want our guys to show off that they're proud to be Americans. Of course, a lot of African Americans were furious.
When George got back to Fifth Ward, he was known as the Uncle Tom, the guy who didn't stand there and raise his fist on the victory stand. And he was shunned, and George was absolutely shocked by this.
George became even harder and tougher, and if he couldn't satisfy you and please you by running around like this happy American idol who's just won the gold medal in the ring with his American flag, he'll just start crunching.
In his quest for a return bout with Muhammad Ali, George Foreman won 5 straight fights, all by knockout. Then, on a hot night in San Juan, Puerto Rico in March of 1977, he was set back by a unanimous 12-round decision to Jimmy Young, who knocked down Foreman in the final round.
I think George is trying to prove something. I think he tried to go the distance. He had Young out and wouldn't knock him out. I said, finish him, George. Didn't want to finish him.
George got so dehydrated in the process of chasing Young all over the place that after the fight was over, he suffered hallucinations in the locker room.
And all of a sudden, he gets this feeling like there's blood trickling from his forehead, which there isn't. He feels like there's a crown of thorns around his head.
He says, I'm telling you, I'm bleeding. And all these spots supposedly that Jesus bled when he was on the cross. He started screaming, I'm born again, hallelujah. Jesus Christ is coming alive in me. I'm born again. Flinging people all around.
The way he tells it is that the hand of God showed him exactly what eternal death looks like.
That was this long tunnel, and it was getting darker and darker. He's like, God, I'll help sick people. I'll give money to cancer. And God told him, say, I don't want your money, I want you. And then all of a sudden he said, the hand just reached back. It was light again. And that's when he said, you can just let me go. Everything's fine.
He was born again that night after that fight, and just the fear of death, he felt literally his life oozing out of him. And that night changed his whole world.
I looked in his eyes, like a soul that had occupied that body was gone. This was a total new person.
People were skeptical. People thought, here's this George Foreman, he's a boxer. All of a sudden, he's found God. Now there's got to be a gimmick to it.
You can judge George's change of heart by this one incident when he literally ran into the guy who had almost stolen George blind, his old friend. And the guy, when he saw George, started running away, and George took that long arm and pulled him back, and he said, come here, Leroy, you're my friend, you're my buddy.
2 months after his loss to Young, Foreman fervently announced he was leaving the ring to fight exclusively for God.
I would never get out there and take my shirt off in front of all them people like that. Sometimes I wonder, how did I ever do that? Take my shirt off like that and hit a man.
He decided to simplify his life. He got rid of the sports cars. He didn't watch television for 10 years. Everything was the Bible.
He became a preacher, literally on the street corners where he used to steal hubcaps and beat up people.
George had this little kind of boom box that ran on batteries with a microphone, walked out on a street corner by a stoplight, and was preaching.
He would walk up to cars. He would walk up to people on the streets and start to tell them about God and about hell and about the devil and about how they needed to repent.
People would walk by him, ain't you George Foreman? Yeah, I said, that George Foreman is dead. People got this thing that George was a nut, man. They said, man, I saw George Foreman on the corner. He's crazy.
I was a little concerned about whether or not somebody might have had him picked up one day on a mental health warrant.
He had read a biblical passage, when you have finished the work that God has you here for, you will know it and it will be time. He checks into the hotel and he decides he's going to die. Closes the door, doesn't eat, reads the Bible. 2 or 3 days later, he's still alive. So he says, well, you know, I must have done this wrong somehow.
If Foreman found peace and balance in his work for God, his search for the right woman was fraught with failure. Divorced once as a fighter, the preacher was married and divorced 3 times between 1977 and 1983.
He was a guy who had never had anything. Now all of a sudden you got women coming at you from everywhere. I think he was overwhelmed, he was overmatched.
Women, they're thinking, well, once I marry him, I got Saks at my disposal, I got Bloomingdale's at my disposal, I got all this money, I can do this. But after he became a preacher, that's not the kind of wife he wanted. He wanted a wife that was willing to stand side by side with him. He wanted to have a woman that was willing to sacrifice.
In June of 1983, Foreman's 4th wife, Andrea, left him, taking the 2 children to her native St. Lucia in the Caribbean islands.
He goes down there and he organizes this whole Mission Impossible escapade so that he can go back and kidnap his children. He knocks on the door and the nanny opens the door and he says, I don't want any trouble, I'm just here to take my kids back. So they drive to the airport and they're surrounded suddenly by the military. The way to get off the island is on a marijuana smuggling boat.
Here's these Rastafarians who are rolling dope, taking him to freedom. And George realized that this judgmental religious zealot who's telling people that if you're evil, you're going to hell forever, that whole thing is another facade. And that, again, he sees the fallacy of these different faces he keeps putting in front of the world. And yet another George Foreman comes out of that.
After divorcing Andrea and gaining joint custody of their children, Foreman in 1985 married Mary Martelli, who had helped him escape from St. Lucia. With the addition of Mary's child and the 5 they had together, Foreman became the father of 10. Meanwhile, the preacher man continued his ministry at Houston's Church of the Lord Jesus Christ, which he had built in 1981.
Now can I get a witness for my Lord? Who will be a witness for my Lord?
I think the people who see the brusque, surly side of George probably think that religion is just another part of George's showbiz, that it's a part of his public persona. But I don't think that's the case. I think that George is deeply religious.
We went to San Quentin to make a testimony for the prisoners. And then George jumped down there with him, and people started crying, and it was a big, big hullabaloo. And we went over there the next morning, and we baptized about 50 to 75 guys.
He baptized me in his church, and I never felt I would be baptized, but the spirituality and the humanity that he has shown have allowed me to communicate with him on a very deep spiritual level.
After all these years, he found what he had been searching for, and there was some peace in his life.
There was this big
In 1984, George Foreman and his brother Roy opened a youth center in Houston, funded primarily by the former champ. By 1986, the center had taken a heavy toll on Foreman's finances.
His accountant said, George, if you keep putting money into this youth center, man, you're not going to have a dime. And he came in one day, and he says, I know what I can do to raise money. I'll go back to boxing.
I'm back. I'm back. I'm back.
He was a guy who was definitely searching. The old lure pulled him back, and he'd started to find an amalgam of all the different Georges. He could still be a religious man, he could be the happy round man, and be the boxer all at once.
In March of 1987, at 38 years and 267 pounds, returned to the ring after a decade, knocking out journeyman Steve Zowski in the 4th round.
He didn't try to make an instant comeback fight against a big-name opponent. He took his time, he fought lesser fighters, got back into the swing of it, gradually built himself up.
He freely admits that he was out of shape, but he worked really, really hard at it. He spent a lot of time that people just didn't see.
George was never a hard liver when his boxing career was over. It wasn't like he was into drugs or drinking. He didn't smoke. So even though he was in his late 30s, he was able to mount this comeback because he was serious.
However serious he was about his resurrection as a fighter, Foreman came under heavy criticism.
Oh my goodness, why is he doing this? He's beating up people that clearly aren't very good. Why is he tarnishing his whole boxing career?
It was a sideshow. There was this big fat old guy who was barely a shell of his old self. There was one person on earth who took George Foreman's comeback seriously, and that was George Foreman.
I show people that, hey, you're 38 years old, 39, 40, whatever they want to give you. It doesn't mean that I'm dead or you dead. You don't listen to critics. So what? I had a little extra weight on. So what?
He sort of looked like his feet were entrenched in cement. And he had an armadillo defense, but he could still hit. And the last thing that goes is power.
I remember in one conversation that we had, he said, you know, you can be a water truck or you can be a fire truck. If you're a water truck that goes by and nobody notices anything, I choose to be a fire truck with the siren going and the lights flashing so people will notice me.
F. Scott Fitzgerald said that there are no second acts in American public lives. More so than anyone else, George Foreman disproved that. He entirely remade himself from this specter of evil into Santa Claus. And no one else in American history has accomplished as complete a transformation.
I said, what changed you? So he said, when I decided to come back to boxing, I decided that I wanted to be liked. And in order to be liked, you have to like.
He had a plan, and I think that he needed years for it to mature, and he gave it time to breathe. It's like a great artist going out there and thinking, okay, I'm thinking about this sculpture. I don't know exactly what it's going to be yet, but it's formulated in his mind, and he literally resculpted himself.
To show the whole world that the age 40 or 50 is not a death sentence. We're going to celebrate and drink our Geritol and eat our hamburgers.
He made jokes of himself. He used to say that Evander Holyfield had a nutritionist. He had room service. His trainers were named Baskin and Robbins.
It's going to be big buffets set up. I'm going to train hard every day and walk through there and grab legs of chicken, roast of beef, porks of chops.
They make believe eating with the hamburgers, junk food and everything. But the guy knew what to do, what to eat. He knew how to play the crowd.
He encouraged the laughter. He would sort of tempt them to make fun of him.
And when I miss Alison Rodriguez with my right hand, then my left, I'm going to belly bump him. He's going to be in trouble. They look at me and they say, he reminds me of old grandpa, old Uncle so-and-so. They've got to cheer for me because if they cheer against me, they're cheering against their own grandpa.
In April of 1991, with a generation of baby boomers in rapt attention, 42-year-old Foreman fought heavyweight champion Evander Holyfield.
If there were any remaining doubts about the legitimacy of George's chances, he may have erased them in the last 30 seconds.
I thought George went about as far as he could go when he fought Evander Holyfield. And he fought a very brave fight.
Although the 28-year-old champion kept his title by winning a unanimous 12-round decision, Foreman in no way resembled the loser he had been 17 years earlier in Kinshasa.
And he went in there and was extremely competitive with Evander Holyfield, had a chance to win the fight. And I think that's when people said, hey, boy, if we didn't know it before, this guy is really legit and he really can fight.
He's now proved himself going into the cauldron against the heavyweight champion and nearly winning. And he's reinforced his nice guy image. Heartfelt as it was in the ring, we now have become fans of his.
George completely became what he needed to be in order to be loved, to be liked, to be adored, and to be successful. Assuming for a moment that he was, in fact, searching all his life for respect, he has hit the pot on the other side of the rainbow.
There was a calculated transition. The same way as I knew that he wasn't this monster in his first life, I also knew that he wasn't exactly this guy handing out apples on a corner stand.
I don't think people totally changed. Right under the surface of George is probably somebody who is not totally at ease, always slightly suspicious.
If you watch carefully, when the cameras aren't rolling and he thinks people aren't watching, he's still got that side to him that says, don't tread on me. George Foreman is not Santa Claus. He is not a guy you want to cross.
There was nobody around, and a pretty well-known boxing trainer patted him on the belly and said, George, you're putting a little weight on there. And George Foreman just walked right past him and said, don't be effing with me, Richie. Don't you be effing with me. And he didn't say F. He put all the letters in there. I was thinking, that doesn't sound like the Reverend George Foreman that I've come to know.
George Foreman is a con artist. He's been able to plaster that grin on his face and do very well for himself.
George Foreman is a performer. He's somebody who lights up and activates for the moment. And, you know, the camera comes on, and it's as though a separate circuit has turned on in George's body. The big smile lights up.
And that smile alone has been worth hundreds of millions of dollars to him.
Right in the middle of his comeback, George makes the cover of Forbes magazine, not as a boxer, not as a heavyweight contender, but as a businessman.
In 1999, George Foreman hit the jackpot. He signed a $137.5 million agreement to help market the George Foreman Lean Mean grilling machine. The ex-champ turned preacher has also earned millions more, endorsing other products from meat to mufflers.
George Foreman ranks in the top 25 of all time in terms of total money taken in from athlete endorsements. He used to make $25,000 a year when he was a heavyweight champion, and now he makes more than $25,000 a day.
Boxers traditionally have a hard time being commercially marketable in terms of products and going beyond the fringes of boxing. George Foreman changed that to a great extent because he became very marketable, and he did it through his personality.
He learned from Muhammad Ali. He saw what Ali did and the way people viewed him, and he saw how he was viewed after he got beaten by Ali. People really didn't want anything to do with him because he was this sort of hard guy. So when he decided to come back, you know, he changed his whole modus operandi.
I had to learn it the hard way. I'd be an evangelist on the street, and people would pass me by. I had to start talking and selling what I believed in. And I'm sold now. I can sell anything.
For someone who had come a long way from those lean days in Houston's Fifth Ward, one dream remained unrealized. Then, in 1994, 20 years after losing to Muhammad Ali, Foreman, at 45, got a last shot at redeeming himself in the ring when he faced heavyweight champ Michael Moorer.
He was a haunted guy. But from that moment in Zaire, Ali was a ghost living in his head. He kept indicating all week he had to erase what happened in Zaire.
What was most interesting about his comeback in terms of him as a fighter, you saw the inner qualities he had as an athlete that were not apparent during his first career. And that was just how determined and tough a man he is.
Foreman was losing every minute of every run. It wasn't really a competitive fight.
Solid right hand by Moore. Foreman's left eye beginning to close.
Those of us at ringside and working press would turn to each other and going, what's holding this guy up?
Uppercut by Moore blasted Foreman's chin backward.
There was this resignation in the crowd because they realized, hey, he's not going to win the fight. This is the end of the line. And then all of a sudden comes that punch out of nowhere.
Down goes Moore on a right hand. It happened. It happened.
And he conned us into standing in front of him. You know, big hamburger eating, grinning George, you know, I won't do nothing to you. I'm old. He was able to con him to a certain extent to stand there, to feel comfortable.
He said, my whole idea the whole night was to invite him in, like he wanted the fly to come to the web and make him more confident. I could take his punches all night. All I needed was one shot.
He said to me, what do you think of the fight? And I said, well, you know, you lost every minute. He said, yeah, that's just the way I figured it. I lost every minute until I knocked him out.
When George pulls it off, the entire place erupts, goes absolutely nuts. People were just screaming out, can you believe what George Foreman has accomplished?
When he knocks out Michael Moore to regain the championship, he is wearing the red trunks he wore in the ring against Muhammad Ali in Zaire. He has now come all the way back.
He was better than Muhammad Ali the night that they fought, but he lost the world title. Now here was a guy maybe who was better than him, and he got the title back, so he kind of evened the score.
I don't think there's any accomplishment like that that you can find anywhere else in sports. I once heard somebody ask whether it was just as impressive for Jack Nicklaus to win the Masters at age 46 as it was for George Foreman to win the heavyweight championship at age 45, and this person stated the obvious. Nobody was hitting Jack.
While the rest of us were celebrating his victory, George made his way out about 2 a.m. Sunday morning, got into his limo, went to the airport, flew to Houston so that he could preach in his church the following morning.
Within a year, the fighting preacher was stripped of his WBA title for not facing the top contender. In 1997, Foreman finally quit the ring with 76 wins and 5 losses. It had been a drama in 2 acts.
In the first half of his career, he tried desperately to be Sonny Liston. In the second half, he tried to be Muhammad Ali, and somehow he pulled them both off.
He exhibited such human qualities when the second George Foreman emerged that the first George Foreman was really forgotten. And I didn't think George was a bad guy, the first one. I thought he needed love, and I thought he had to find himself, you know, and he did that.
George had many sides and showed some of them to the world. And I'm sure there are many Georges that we haven't seen.
One of the reasons that we seem to love George so much is because we know that he is still the monster. He can still pulverize us. And yet, in choosing not to, he makes us feel good.